The reunion was louder than I remembered. Backyard string lights strung like tired stars, plastic folding chairs in a clumsy circle, and the smell of grilling sausages mingling with old perfume and spritzed lawn citrus. I sat between my husband and his teenage cousin, folding my napkin into a neat triangle because I had always preferred to control small things. My mother-in-law arrived late, as if timing her entrance for maximum attention, wearing an ivory dress that gleamed under the bobes. She greeted people with the practiced smile of a woman used to being admired, and then turned to me with a tilt of her head that carried judgment. When she spoke, it was soft enough for others to lean in, yet sharp enough to leave a bruise on my confidence. I smiled because I had learned to mask my surprise. She waited until people were sipping iced tea and laughing about shared childhood memories, then leaned forward and said, too sweetly to be kind, "She's just jobless and useless, you know." The words hit like a fist. I felt a hush that wasn't real, only my ears amplified it, and watched for the flinch my husband tried to hide. My cheeks flushed, not entirely from embarrassment, but from a familiar coil of anger that always wound tight whenever someone tried to diminish me. People chuckled awkwardly, as if discomfort could be mistaken for humor. My breath stayed steady, and I kept my hands in my lap because I didn't want to give the scene my motion. I had learned to count insults like coins in a jar, saving them all. No one in that circle knew the truth about me. I wasn't unemployed because I couldn't work. I had chosen a low-profile life, partly because it suited our family's public image, and partly because the business I owned, quiet, private, and successful, didn't need my face on magazine covers. I had started the small publishing imprint 9 years earlier out of sheer stubbornness and a pile of unpaid internships, turning obscure manuscripts into steady revenue and quiet respect within a tight literary community. I kept the company under a different name and under layers of legal shells because the last thing I wanted was to be judged by the same people who judged me as their daughter-in-law. It amused me then, and it would be important later, how easily assumptions settled like dust over our lives. I kept records meticulously, like a ledger of grudges. The timing of her insult was perfect because 2 weeks earlier my team had passed on a manuscript from an author using the name she always used when she wanted to be immortalized, her own. My editor had called it a vanity project, overwrought, thin on character, and heavy on sermonizing, and sent a polite rejection. That rejection had been routed through an alias to avoid personal fallout, but the core decision had my name behind it. I remembered the memo and the internal notes, developmental advice, structural edits, a suggestion that the voice needed to be lived a little before it could be written well. I tucked that knowledge in my mind and kept eating my salad, listening to recycled jokes float over my head like cheap confetti. I had the rejection letter saved in my private files, neatly stamped and time-stamped as evidence. My husband murmured something apologetic into my ear, his breath warm and nervous against my neck, and his cousin tried to steer the conversation toward old sports injuries and college misadventures. I found myself listening to the cadence of their voices, as if cataloging them, each inflection a note I could use for something else. I didn't want to make a scene. Spectacle had never been my method. My revenge would be quiet and precise, like a surgeon's incision rather than a public spectacle. I practiced patience the way some people practice scales on the piano, over and over until it felt like breath. The initial sting of her words cooled into a clear-headed focus, and I began to consider what it would take to reveal the truth without seeming petty. I pictured documents, timestamps, and the slow collapse of her certainty. Running a small press taught me the power of quiet decisions. A manuscript accepted at the right moment could change a life, and a careful rejection could save both the author and the press from years of wasted work. I had built a network of editors who trusted my eye because I gave them credit when it mattered and took the fall when I had to. They knew me as an investor and an occasional editor, never as a public figure. We had a code: do the work, protect the writer, and keep egos out of the process. That code made it possible to assess a manuscript honestly without the spectacle of a name attached. The manuscript that bore my mother-in-law's lines had been evaluated with that same fierce objectivity. They would follow instructions without asking questions, loyal to craft rather than gossip. My mother-in-law wasn't cruel because she wanted to be. She was cruel because she had been taught that superiority was the only currency worth saving. Her brand of politeness was a scalpel, refined over years spent at charity galas and country club luncheons where compliments were traded like favors. She measured people against invisible standards and distributed condescending smiles as if they were alms. I had endured 1,000 tiny corrections that implied I didn't know how to iron, didn't know how to host, didn't know how to keep my husband's family safe from scandal. Each small word was a peg hammered into the same wall of self-doubt. And each hammering taught me how to keep one silent hand ready to build something from the rubble she created. But I also learned to catalog those pegs and plan a blueprint in secret. Around us, conversations swirled like smoke, and most of my husband's relatives nodded as if my value had been settled by someone else's verdict. My sister-in-law dropped a joke about how someone should give me a job, and the table laughed politely because that was easier than asking why I chose to be private. I let them laugh. I nudged my husband with my knee under the table, a small reminder that we were aligned and that he would stand with me if I asked. I knew he would. He knew me in private, where the masks came off. What they didn't know was my file cabinet of editorial notes, annotated with red pen and patience, which chronicled why my mother-in-law's writing had been passed on. Those notes read like a forensic report on tone, structure, and the recurring pitfall of self-praise. I pictured how I might reveal the truth, not with drama, not with a public divorce or a viral post, but with the kind of evidence that would make people reassess what they assumed. A single, clear document could unspool the narrative she'd woven for years, showing the rejection and the reasoning behind it. That paper could hang in the air like a verdict without the need for my voice to carry it. I imagined presenting it at a time when the family would have to notice. Perhaps at the next book club meeting she insisted on hosting, or quietly inserting it into the envelopes of a church fundraiser she loved. There was art in restraint, and I had practiced that art more than she ever suspected. I wanted the revelation to feel inevitable, a logical consequence of facts rather than spectacle. After dessert, when coffee decanted and plates were scraped, I excused myself to the guest room under the pretense of adjusting my hair. In truth, I was checking the messages on my personal device, where my assistant had forwarded the flagged email thread about the manuscript. The thread included the polite rejection, the internal notes, and the blind submission form that matched her handwriting. My assistant knew better than to question why I wanted access. She had been trained to archive and protect company correspondence. I scrolled through the exchange one more time, careful to savor the correctness of their decisions, and then tucked the screenshots into an encrypted folder that only I could open. It was enough for now. I returned to the table carrying a cup of coffee, letting the steam fog my glasses for a second so no one could read my eyes. The conversation resumed with ordinary rhythms. Someone praised the potato salad, another asked about my husband's job, and my mother-in-law leaned back, satisfied with her small victory. I accepted another compliment about my quiet demeanor and practiced a laugh that landed in the right place. Beneath that practiced stillness, My mind filed the steps I would take, when to present the documents, how to frame them as professional feedback rather than a personal attack, and which allies to recruit from the office. I sipped my coffee and felt how close everything already was. A revelation that would come without dramatic flair, but with the slow, unavoidable pull of truth. Soon. The following week, I received an invitation from my mother-in-law for her literary circle, a monthly event where she gathered neighbors, distant cousins, and anyone who might stroke her ego while she read excerpts from her unfinished novels. She attached a message, written in her signature looping script, asking me to bring something productive to share, a not-so-subtle jab meant to remind me of her earlier insult. I accepted with a smile no one could see through the digital reply. In my encrypted folder, the rejection letter and editorial notes rested like hidden weapons, but I didn't plan to brandish them openly yet. My plan required patience, timing, and the element of surprise, because a truth revealed too quickly could look like vengeance rather than consequence. I rehearsed my calm tone the way actors rehearse lines before an audience that matters. When the night arrived, her living room was transformed into a makeshift salon with stacks of her manuscripts piled like trophies on the side table and a bouquet of lilies perfuming the air. She greeted me with a look that was equal parts scrutiny and forced civility, and I responded with a polite nod that gave away nothing. Guests arrived carrying bottles of wine and plates of cookies, laughing too loudly as they settled onto sofas and folding chairs. My husband squeezed my hand once before moving to fetch drinks, his quiet way of saying he trusted me. I sat with my legs crossed, notebook in hand, blending into the wallpaper, waiting for her to begin. She thrived on these performances, and she didn't disappoint. Her voice carried across the room, self-assured, even smug. She began by reading a passage from her latest manuscript, a tale heavy with metaphors and long-winded descriptions that circled the same themes over and over. The audience clapped politely, some even nodding with practiced admiration, though I could see their eyes glazing as the paragraphs dragged on. I scribbled notes in my book, not because I needed them, but because the act of writing lent me credibility. Her voice rose with pride as she concluded, soaking in the applause like a plant leaning towards sunlight. Then she turned her gaze toward me, her smile too wide, and said, "Perhaps my daughter-in-law can finally offer us something of value tonight. Do you have anything to share?" The question wasn't casual. It was a knife offered with its blade exposed. I breathed evenly and nodded. I stood slowly, my notebook still in hand, and glanced around the room with an air of quiet confidence. "I thought," I began softly, "that it might be useful to discuss the realities of publishing. What makes a manuscript strong, what editors often look for, and why some projects don't move forward." Murmurs of curiosity rose from the audience, some leaning in, others flipping to a fresh page in their notebooks. My mother-in-law's eyes narrowed slightly, suspicion flickering beneath her polished expression. I flipped open my notebook to a blank page and spoke clearly, laying out the core ideas of story structure, pacing, and authenticity of voice. People nodded thoughtfully, some scribbling notes as if my words carried unexpected weight. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had spent years building credibility in rooms like this, though never under my real name. As the room warmed to my words, I shifted gently, adding, "Sometimes manuscripts are turned down not because the writer lacks passion, but because the work needs more development, or because the voice feels forced rather than lived." I saw her stiffen at the phrasing, her fingers tightening around her wine glass. The crowd seemed engaged, even appreciative, and I continued without hesitation. I spoke about blind submissions, how names are often stripped to prevent bias, how editors evaluate based solely on the writing. This way, I explained, no one is judged by reputation or relationships, only by the story they tell. A few guests looked impressed, nodding at the fairness of the system. My mother-in-law forced a smile, but I saw the cracks forming at the edges of her carefully curated expression. Then I paused, flipping a page, and said, "Of course, there are times when even strong reputations can't guarantee acceptance. A name might carry weight in social circles, but on paper, the words have to stand alone." The silence that followed was thick, like air before a storm. A couple of guests shifted uncomfortably, glancing at her, perhaps wondering if I was drawing from personal experience. I smiled faintly and continued. What truly matters is humility, the willingness to accept feedback and grow, rather than assume success is owed. The sentence hung between us, balanced precariously, and I could almost hear her heartbeat racing across the room. I remained calm, my tone measured, my hands steady on the notebook, as if this were just another workshop. But every word carried a shadow of the truth I still held. Her cheeks flushed faintly, though she masked it with a laugh, dismissing my comments as interesting theory. The audience clapped politely again, this time with more warmth toward me than before, and I felt the subtle shift in the room's energy. They were beginning to see me differently, not as the silent, jobless wife she had described, but as someone with authority, someone who knew. My husband's eyes met mine across the room, pride flickering in his gaze. A private acknowledgement only I could decode. My mother-in-law, however, sat rigid, her smile frozen, her hands locked around her glass as though it were an anchor. The first ripple had spread, and I knew more waves would follow. Quietly, invisibly, the foundation of her authority was beginning to erode, and all I had done was speak what I knew. Later that evening, when the gathering dispersed, she approached me in the kitchen while I helped clear glasses. Her tone was sharp, stripped of the public charm she performed for guests. "What are you playing at?" she asked under her breath, her eyes darting toward the doorway to make sure no one was listening. I placed a glass gently on the counter and met her gaze evenly. "Nothing," I said simply, "just sharing what I know." The ambiguity unsettled her more than an outright challenge would have. She searched my face for cracks, for signs of bluff, but I gave her nothing. Silence was my shield, and patience my weapon. I turned back to the dishes, leaving her to stew in her suspicions. The first move had been made, and now the game would unfold on my terms. The following morning, I received a message from one of the guests, thanking me for my insights and asking if I would recommend resources for aspiring authors. It made me smile, not because I sought recognition, but because it signaled that the narrative had already shifted. People now saw me not as a passive guest, but as a quiet authority. My mother-in-law had wanted me humiliated. Instead, I had been elevated in front of her peers. That imbalance would gnaw at her, and I knew she wouldn't be able to resist probing deeper. I was ready for it. Every step she took toward confrontation would only lead her closer to the truth I controlled. And when the moment was right, I would let her stumble into it, unprepared for the fall. The stage was set, and all I had to do was wait. A few days passed in uneasy silence, and then the inevitable happened. My mother-in-law called me directly, her voice coded in forced politeness that didn't mask the edge beneath it. She asked if I would stop by for coffee and a chat, and I agreed without hesitation. I knew what she wanted, to corner me, to assert dominance again after losing ground at her literary circle. When I arrived, her kitchen smelled of cinnamon and brewing coffee. But the warmth didn't extend to her eyes. She gestured for me to sit, sliding a cup across the counter with more force than necessary. "You seemed very knowledgeable the other night," she said. her tone cautious. Almost too knowledgeable. Where exactly did you learn all that? I sipped slowly, savoring the moment, before answering with a vague smile that gave nothing away. I've always loved books, I said evenly, setting the cup down gently. When you spend enough time studying the industry, you learn a few things. Her eyes narrowed, suspicion flashing like lightning before she smoothed it over with a brittle laugh. She wanted details, proof she could use to belittle me, but I wouldn't give her the satisfaction. Instead, I let the silence stretch, forcing her to fill it. She leaned closer, her perfume sharp in the air, and pressed. You're not just some idle wife, are you? There's something you're not telling us. I tilted my head, feigning mild amusement, and replied, Everyone has layers, don't they? Even you. The deliberate echo unsettled her, and I could see her hands tighten around the porcelain handle of her cup. The game was tilting, and she felt it. Later that afternoon, I returned home to find my husband waiting, curiosity written across his face. He asked what his mother wanted, and I told him the truth in careful fragments. That she suspected I was more than she thought, that she was digging for answers she wouldn't like to find. He listened quietly, then laughed softly, shaking his head. She's not going to stop until she knows, he said, wrapping an arm around my shoulder. And when she finds out, it'll undo her. I leaned against him, feeling both the comfort of his presence and the quiet thrill of inevitability. I didn't need to push her any further. Her pride would carry her straight into the trap. I just needed to prepare the evidence, lay the groundwork, and let her impatience do the rest. The next opportunity came sooner than expected. She had apparently decided to prove her literary talents once and for all by hosting a public reading at the local library, inviting friends, neighbors, and even a few small-town reporters. She sent invitations in glossy envelopes stamped with her initials, boasting that her new manuscript would finally silence the doubters. I received my copy with a handwritten note. You might learn something about real writing. I smiled at the irony, carefully placing the envelope in my drawer alongside the rejection letter from my press. The juxtaposition was almost poetic. Her hubris in one hand, her dismissal in the other. I decided then that the library event would be the stage for the truth, though I would never raise my voice. The documents would speak louder than anything I could ever say. On the night of the reading, the library's community room buzzed with anticipation. Folding chairs filled quickly, and a small podium stood beneath a banner that read, An Evening with Local Authors. My mother-in-law stood tall at the front, basking in attention as people shook her hand and congratulated her in advance. I slipped quietly into the third row, dressed simply, notebook in hand, blending into the crowd. My husband sat beside me, his expression unreadable but supportive. The event began with polite introductions, and then she launched into her reading, her voice swelling with pride as she delivered paragraphs weighed down by flowery prose. The audience clapped dutifully, some genuinely entertained, others politely enduring. I watched carefully, waiting for the right moment, my folder of documents tucked inside my bag, like a secret waiting to unfold. When she concluded her reading, she opened the floor to questions, inviting praise more than critique. A few guests obliged, asking about her process or inspiration, which she answered with the self-assuredness of someone convinced of her greatness. Then one guest asked the question I had been hoping for. Have you submitted this to any publishers yet? Her expression flickered for a split second before she answered confidently. I've had interest, of course, but I'm considering my options. That was the opening I had anticipated, the moment when her claim and my truth could collide. My husband glanced at me, sensing my readiness. Slowly I raised my hand, my voice calm and even when she acknowledged me. Some manuscripts do make the rounds before finding the right home, I said. Did this one receive feedback already? The silence deepened. Her smile faltered, though she recovered quickly, insisting, nothing serious, just minor opinions from people who don't understand my style. I nodded thoughtfully, then slipped my folder open, pulling out a single page with the press's letterhead visible at the top. My voice remained measured, almost academic, as I said, sometimes feedback is more than opinion. It can be constructive. Would you like me to share an example? Gasps rippled through the room as eyes darted between us. My mother-in-law froze, her hands trembling slightly as she realized what I held. I didn't wave the paper dramatically. I simply let it rest on my lap, angled so that those beside me could see. The rejection letter was polite, professional, and unmistakably addressed to her. The words that had once been private now hung in the air like a quiet verdict. She stammered, insisting it was a misunderstanding, that the rejection was only temporary. But the room had already shifted. Guests whispered, some exchanging incredulous looks, others hiding smiles behind their hands. I kept my expression neutral, my tone steady, as I explained the importance of constructive criticism in writing, emphasizing how every writer, even talented ones, faced rejection at some point. The implication was clear. Rejection was part of the process. But denying it revealed insecurity. The weight of the truth pressed down on her performance, unraveling the authority she had tried to command. I didn't need to expose the entire correspondence. The single page was enough. The silence that followed was heavier than applause, and in it, her image cracked like porcelain. She had always sought admiration, but now she had been handed reality. After the event ended, she avoided me, retreating quickly while muttering excuses about deadlines and commitments. The guests, however, lingered, approaching me with questions about publishing, about resources, about what it really took to succeed. I answered kindly, keeping my tone professional, careful not to gloat. My husband stayed close, watching with quiet pride as people began to view me differently. No longer as the silent daughter-in-law, but as someone with knowledge and authority. By the time we left the library, the whispers had already spread, and I knew her reputation within that circle would never be the same. She had built her image on superiority, and now it had collapsed under the weight of her own arrogance. The beauty of it was that I hadn't needed to shout. The truth had done all the work. The drive home was quiet, the hum of the car filling the silence. My husband reached over, lacing his fingers with mine, and said simply, "She'll never forget this." I nodded, staring out at the darkened streets, their lights blurring past the window. "Neither will I replied softly. Revenge hadn't been loud or violent. It had been subtle, precise, and irreversible. She had called me jobless and useless, but in the end, her own words and failures had revealed who truly lacked value. I leaned back, feeling the weight lift from my shoulders, knowing the game was over. For the first time in years, I felt no need to hide. The truth had spoken for me, and it had spoken loudly enough to echo long after the night had ended. My quiet revenge was complete. The days after the library reading were thick with silence from my mother-in-law. She didn't call, didn't text, and at Sunday dinner, she avoided meeting my eyes altogether, her usual biting remarks replaced with strained politeness. The absence of her insults was almost louder than the words themselves, like a song cut off mid-note. My husband noticed too. He leaned over during the meal and whispered, "It's almost peaceful without her commentary." I smiled faintly, careful not to let the triumph show too brightly on my face. The truth had already made its mark, and she was retreating to lick her wounds. I didn't need to press further. Still, I knew her pride wouldn't allow her to remain silent forever. Pride has a way of clawing back, even when it's already been broken down to splinters. That week, whispers began circling among family members. A cousin messaged me to ask if it was true I worked in publishing, and an aunt emailed to thank me for the bravery I'd shown at the library event. The family group chat, usually dominated by my mother-in-law's updates about social gatherings and committee meetings, fell unusually quiet. When she finally posted again, it was about a charity fundraiser. No mention of writing or her manuscript. Her silence on the subject only confirmed what I already knew. The rejection had landed hard, and she couldn't spin it in her favor. Meanwhile, my husband's siblings reached out with unexpected warmth, thanking me for my insights and even asking for advice on their own projects. I gave what I could, knowing every word only deepened the contrast between her arrogance and my quiet authority. One afternoon, I walked into a local cafe and overheard two women at the counter whispering about the library event. "Can you believe she got rejected like that?" one said, shaking her head. The other chuckled softly. "And her daughter-in-law's the one who actually knew what she was talking about." I ordered my coffee and said nothing, but inside a current of satisfaction warmed me. It wasn't spite, it was validation, proof that the truth had spread naturally, without me pushing it. My silence had amplified the story, letting others tell it in their own words. That, I realized, was the truest form of revenge, when the people around you carry the narrative for you. I didn't need to gloat. The whispers would do the work. I walked out with my coffee, shoulders lighter than they had been in years. Eventually, the confrontation I had anticipated arrived. My mother-in-law appeared at our doorstep one evening, unannounced, her eyes dark and stormy. She demanded to speak privately, and I led her into the living room where the dim light softened the sharpness of her features. "You embarrassed me," she said flatly, her voice trembling with controlled fury. I folded my hands in my lap and looked at her calmly. "No," I corrected gently. "You embarrassed yourself." I simply let the truth be seen. The words landed between us like a stone dropped into still water. Her lips parted as if to retort, but no words came. She searched for an angle, a way to twist the narrative back in her favor, but the rejection letter remained undeniable. Silence stretched, and for once, she had no weapon sharp enough to pierce me. She tried another tactic: pity. "You don't understand what it's like to want something so badly," she said, her voice cracking slightly. "To dream of being recognized and to be dismissed like that." I listened without interrupting, noting the irony that she finally spoke about rejection as if she were the only one who had ever tasted it. I leaned forward slightly, my voice steady. "Every writer gets rejected. Every single one. The difference is in how you handle it. Some take it as fuel to grow. Others let it consume them. You chose pride over humility." Her eyes shimmered, whether from anger or unspoken tears, I couldn't tell. For the first time, I saw not the towering critic who had belittled me for years, but a woman shrinking under the weight of her own unmet expectations. Our conversation ended without resolution. She left abruptly, muttering something about people not respecting talent anymore. My husband found me sitting quietly afterward, my hands folded in my lap. "What did she say?" he asked, concern in his eyes. I told him the truth, that she had tried to turn her humiliation into my cruelty, but that the reality of rejection was hers alone to bear. He wrapped his arms around me and whispered, "You've already won. Don't let her drag you down with her." His words grounded me, reminding me that revenge wasn't about destruction. It was about balance, about setting the record straight. I hadn't ruined her life. I had simply exposed the truth she tried so hard to bury. That distinction mattered to me, even if she could never see it. Weeks turned into months, and slowly the family dynamic shifted. At gatherings, people no longer deferred to her with unquestioned admiration. They still respected her role as matriarch, but the unquestionable authority she once wielded had been fractured. I, meanwhile, found myself invited into conversations I had once been excluded from, asked for advice, acknowledged for my insights. My silence had given way to a quiet presence, steady and undeniable. She remained polite, careful, but the sharp edge of her comments had dulled. She knew better now than to call me jobless or useless. Every time her eyes met mine across the dinner table, there was a flicker of something new, something like wariness, perhaps even reluctant respect. She would never admit it aloud, but she had learned who I truly was. I didn't flaunt my ownership of the press. I continued to operate in the background, preferring the quiet power of anonymity. But within the family, my role had shifted permanently. They now saw me as more than the quiet wife, more than the target of her barbs. I had earned that recognition not by shouting, but by letting the truth unfold naturally. And as the months passed, I realized I no longer carried the same weight of resentment. Her words no longer pierced me. Because they no longer mattered. The ledger of insults I had kept for years had been balanced at last. My revenge hadn't been loud or cruel. It had been quiet, precise, and complete. I could finally breathe without the heaviness of her judgment pressing against me. The night before Thanksgiving, my husband and I sat together, reflecting on the year. He raised a glass and said, "To peace at the table." I clinked my glass against his, smiling softly. "To peace," I agreed. And in that moment, I realized the story had come full circle. She had called me jobless, useless, a burden. But in the end, her own ambition had exposed the truth, while my patience had revealed my strength. I didn't need her validation anymore. My life, my work, and my quiet revenge had spoken for me. As the lights twinkled on the porch and the air grew cold with winter's approach, I knew I had reclaimed my dignity in the most enduring way possible. Revenge hadn't just set me free. It had silenced the voice that once tried to define me. The holidays arrived with their usual whirlwind of decorations, gatherings, and carefully rehearsed family rituals. But something had changed beneath the surface. My mother-in-law hosted Christmas Eve at her house, as she always did, yet the grandeur seemed forced. The lights were strung too tightly, the tree over-decorated, the food plated with more effort than love. Guests arrived in their winter coats, shaking snow from their boots, and offered polite greetings. I noticed how their eyes flickered toward me differently now, curious, even deferential, as if the quiet authority I had shown at the library still lingered in their memory. My mother-in-law noticed it too. She smiled wider than usual, laughed louder, but the control she once wielded had slipped. Her throne at the head of the table was still there, but its crown had begun to rust in silence. During dinner, she attempted small jabs cloaked in humor. "Not everyone here has a career to keep them busy," she remarked lightly while carving the turkey, waiting for the ripple of laughter that once followed such comments. This time, the room stayed quiet, the silence pressing in like a wall. My husband reached for my hand under the table, squeezing it gently, and I felt the tide shifting further in my favor. My mother-in-law's eyes darted around. Unsettled by the lack of validation, she quickly changed the subject to holiday shopping, her words tumbling out faster than usual. The shift was subtle but undeniable. Her authority had lost its weight, and everyone present could feel it. I sat calmly, savoring the change without gloating, knowing the balance had been restored, not through force, but through truth revealed in the right moment. Later, when desserts were served and carols played faintly in the background, my niece asked me about publishing. "How do you know if a story is good enough?" she whispered, her eyes wide with genuine curiosity. I explained gently, describing the importance of honesty, structure, and letting a story breathe. Others leaned in to listen, asking follow-up questions, and soon a small circle formed around me. My mother-in-law watched from across the room, her fork frozen halfway to her mouth, her smile brittle as she realized the spotlight no longer belonged to her. I wasn't performing or seeking attention. I was simply sharing what I knew. But in doing so, I had become the voice people wanted to hear. Her silence stretched like a shadow, but I didn't look her way. She had taught me enough about cruelty. I had nothing left to learn. In January, she attempted one final act of defiance. A local magazine ran a feature on aspiring authors, and she submitted her manuscript for consideration, hoping to regain some ground. I knew about it because one of my editors forwarded the submission to me, asking how I wanted it handled. I read the draft again, noting the same flaws as before, and instructed them to treat it like any other submission: blind, fair, professional. Weeks later, the magazine published its feature, and her name was absent. She didn't mention it to anyone, but I heard through a cousin that she had been furious, accusing the editors of bias. I said nothing. By then, I didn't need to. Every attempt she made to prove herself only underlined the truth we already knew. Her pride had become her undoing, and I no longer carried its weight. Spring brought renewal, both in the world outside and within me. My publishing house launched 2 successful titles that climbed bestseller lists, though my involvement remained quiet, hidden beneath the company's name. My husband and I moved into a new home, filled with sunlight and bookshelves, a space that felt ours in every sense. At family gatherings, conversations shifted away from her critiques and toward genuine exchanges. My siblings-in-law asked for advice. My nieces and nephews wanted book recommendations, and even distant cousins sought me out for guidance. My mother-in-law remained present but subdued, her voice no longer the loudest in the room. I didn't feel triumph so much as relief. The constant battle for dignity had ended, and in its place was peace. My revenge had never been about crushing her. It was about reclaiming my place in the family without apology. Over time, I noticed her watching me with a different expression. Not admiration, but not quite disdain either. Perhaps it was recognition, perhaps grudging respect, or perhaps just the acceptance that she could no longer define me with her words. I had stopped waiting for an apology. I knew it would never come, but I no longer needed it. The balance had been restored, and with it, the freedom to live without her shadow pressing down. One evening, as we sat together during a quiet gathering, she surprised me by asking softly, "Do you ever regret not putting your name on your work?" I looked at her carefully, recognizing the vulnerability hidden beneath the question. "No," I answered simply. "I don't need my name on the cover to know my worth." She nodded faintly and for once didn't argue. Years later, I would look back on that period as a turning point, not just in my relationship with her, but in my own understanding of power. Power wasn't about volume or dominance. It was about truth, patience, and the quiet strength of knowing who you are when others try to define you. My mother-in-law never truly changed. Her pride remained, her need for validation endured, but she no longer directed it at me. She had learned, painfully, that her words carried no weight against my reality. I had been called jobless and useless, but I had proven myself without shouting, without spectacle. The quiet revenge I carried out wasn't just against her. It was for me, for the dignity I had protected all along. And in the end, that was enough, more than enough. My silence had spoken louder than her insults ever could. By the time my publishing house celebrated its 10th anniversary, I stood in front of my team at a private dinner, thanking them for their loyalty and brilliance. My husband sat beside me, proud, and no one in the room needed to know about the years of insults I had endured. Those memories had faded into background noise, replaced by the steady hum of success and peace. My mother-in-law was still part of our lives, still attending family gatherings, but her barbs had dulled into irrelevance. When she looked at me now, it was no longer as someone to belittle, but as someone she could not ignore. My revenge had been delivered quietly, and it had lasted. As I raised my glass in a toast that evening, I thought of the journey from insult to vindication, and I felt no bitterness, only closure. On a summer evening, years after the infamous library reading, my husband and I hosted our own family gathering. Children played in the yard, cousins swapped stories, and laughter spilled into the twilight air. My mother-in-law sat quietly on the porch, sipping iced tea, her gaze distant but softened. At one point, she called me over, and to my surprise, she said, "You've built something remarkable." It wasn't an apology, but it was the closest she would ever come. I smiled, thanked her, and returned to my guests. In that moment, I realized revenge doesn't always end with dramatic confrontations or complete victories. Sometimes it ends with quiet acknowledgement, with the knowledge that the truth has settled in and cannot be erased. She had once called me jobless and useless, but my life had spoken louder. That was my lasting triumph. The outro came naturally when the night grew dark and the guests began to leave. I stood on the porch, watching fireflies spark across the yard, and felt a sense of peace I hadn't known before. "Life has a way of revealing the truth," I said softly, almost to myself. "Sometimes you don't need to fight with fire. You just need to wait until the smoke clears, and then everyone sees what was real all along." My husband slipped an arm around me, and together we looked out into the night. My revenge story had ended not with an explosion, but with a quiet, undeniable shift. And in that quiet, I had found the freedom I deserved. Time has a way of softening sharp edges, but some memories remain vivid. Even years later, I can still recall the exact pitch of her voice when she called me jobless and useless at that reunion. The smirk she wore as though the insult was a crown. Back then, it burned like fire under my skin. But now it feels more like an echo, something that happened to a different version of me. That younger me hadn't yet learned the quiet power of patience, hadn't yet realized that truth eventually rises no matter how deeply someone tries to bury it. Standing here today, I see how far I've come, how much I've built, and how little her words matter. Her insults were fleeting. My work, my life, and my quiet revenge became permanent. I'm proud of that balance. My marriage grew stronger in the aftermath, too. My husband never doubted me, but the way he stood by me when the truth came out changed the foundation of our relationship. He saw me not just as his wife, but as an equal partner, someone with her own strength, her own story, her own victories. That recognition mattered more than anything else. Together, we built a life that wasn't defined by his family's judgment, but by our shared values. He often reminds me of that night at the library, how proud he felt when I calmly revealed the truth without raising my voice. He calls it the moment I silenced the room. I call it the moment I stopped needing anyone else's validation. The silence was powerful, not because it ended the noise, but because it confirmed what I always knew deep down. Even my relationship with my mother-in-law, though never warm, found a strange equilibrium. She never apologized directly, but the barbs stopped. In their place came occasional acknowledgments, small comments about how I seemed knowledgeable or capable. They were far from compliments, but compared to her earlier cruelty, they were a kind of surrender. I learned not to seek more than she could give. The truth had already spoken for me, and it was louder than any apology could ever be. Sometimes, late at night, I wondered if she ever regretted the way she treated me. if she replayed those moments and realized how unnecessary they were. But whether she did or didn't no longer mattered. I had found peace, not because she changed, but because I had grown stronger. That, to me, was the true victory. The publishing house thrived. With every successful title, with every new author whose career blossomed under our imprint, I felt the weight of her insults fade further into the background. I no longer carried them as wounds. They became markers of how far I had risen. When people in the industry praised my leadership, they had no idea about the quiet battles I had fought behind closed doors. No idea how personal this journey had once been. That anonymity was my shield and my pride. I didn't need recognition in family circles or public spaces. My revenge wasn't about fame. It was about dignity. And dignity, once reclaimed, doesn't fade. It stays with you, steady as a heartbeat. I had turned her attempt to diminish me into fuel that carried me further than I ever expected. That transformation was priceless. Family reunions continued over the years, though their tone shifted. Where once her voice dominated the table, conversations now moved more freely, balanced, and inclusive. People looked at me differently, listened when I spoke, asked questions instead of dismissing me. My mother-in-law remained present, but subdued, her dominance replaced by a quieter presence that no longer dictated the room. Sometimes she would glance at me with a look I couldn't quite name. Resentment, perhaps, but tinged with something like reluctant admiration. She never repeated those old insults. She couldn't. The truth had stripped them of their sting. Watching her, I realized the revenge had extended beyond one event or one letter. It had reshaped the entire dynamic of our family. I hadn't just defended myself. I had shifted the balance of power. And I did it without ever raising my voice. The final piece of closure came unexpectedly during a conversation with my niece. She was preparing to submit her first manuscript, nervous about rejection, and she came to me for advice. Sitting together in my office, surrounded by shelves of books, she asked, "How do you handle people who don't believe in you?" I smiled, thinking back to the years of silence and judgment I had endured. "You let your work speak for you," I told her. "People's opinions change, but truth doesn't. If you keep building, keep writing, eventually the noise fades." She nodded, her eyes shining with hope, and in that moment, I realized the story had come full circle. My quiet revenge hadn't just freed me, it had given me something to pass down, a lesson about strength, patience, and dignity. That was the legacy I wanted to leave. And so, when I think back to that first reunion, when her words cut sharp and deep, I don't feel anger anymore. I feel gratitude, oddly enough, because without her attempt to tear me down, I might never have discovered how strong I could be. Her insult was the spark, but my patience was the fire that burned quietly until it reshaped everything. I was the dismissed daughter-in-law once, the woman underestimated and ridiculed. But in the end, I was also the woman who owned the press that defined her failure, the woman who rose without shouting, and the woman who learned the most powerful revenge is quiet, undeniable truth. My story isn't about her insult. It's about my resilience. And if there's one lesson I would leave anyone with, it's this: never underestimate the strength of silence. Sometimes the sweetest revenge isn't loud or cruel. It's simply living your truth until the world can't ignore it anymore. I was called jobless, useless, a burden. But the truth was mine all along, and it spoke louder than she ever could.